Hi, this is Colin with Maker Farm. This is the second video for the TronXY X1 printer build. For this, we're going to start building the Z assembly. To start, you're going to want to get a 2020 aluminum extrusion that is 585 millimeters long. You're going to want to get the X motor mount that is made from acrylic. There's a little picture on the screen. 1 brass nut, 6 of the plastic standoffs, 3 Delrin wheels, 3 of the M5 40 millimeter long bolts, 3 of the M5 lock nuts, 3 M3 8 millimeter long bolts, and 2 M4 8 millimeter long bolts. Also get 2 M5 T-nuts, and last you'll get the black metal bracket. It's bent into an L shape, and you can see a picture of it there on the screen. First thing we're going to do is get the acrylic mount and the 3 M5 by 40 millimeter long bolts. Go ahead and install them in the acrylic piece as shown here in the video. After that, flip it over. We're going to put the plastic spacer on each of the bolts. Then after that, we're going to put a Delrin wheel on each bolt. And then last, we're going to go back and put another spacer on each of the 3 bolts. After that, grab your metal mount and put it on the bolts as shown here, and then get some nylon lock nuts. These are the M5 nylon lock nuts, and go ahead and install those onto the bolts. You want to use a wrench and a screwdriver and tighten those down. We may have to come back later on and push these Delrin wheels in towards each other and then tighten them down to make sure that it makes good contact with the extrusion. Next, we're going to install the brass nut. You're going to also get 3 of the M3 by 8 millimeter long bolts. And then you can just screw it down. The black metal piece is threaded, so when you screw these M3 bolts in, it will just thread into that black piece. Next, we're going to get the 2 M4 by 8 millimeter long bolts and also the 2 M4 T-nuts. We're going to go in these 2 locations here on the acrylic piece. When you install the T-nut, don't tighten it all the way down. We'll do that later. And the bolts will get installed from kind of the back way where the metal mount is. And then the T-nuts will be on the outside. Then you can go ahead and get your aluminum extrusion. You will notice that the hole in the extrusion will line up with that top idler wheel. Then you can go through and tighten down those T-nuts to make sure that the extrusion is locked onto that acrylic piece. Now we're going to install this Z carriage assembly we just built onto the bottom portion of the frame. The Delrin wheels are going to ride on that 2040 extrusion. If this is too loose, we can go through and loosen up all 3 of those Delrin wheels, pull them in towards the extrusion, and then tighten them back down. Now install that back on the frame. Make sure there's no play, but it moves freely up and down. Next, we're going to grab a motor with the GT2 gear on it. This is going to be the X motor. You're also going to need 4 M3 8 millimeter long bolts. The motor is going to get installed into the acrylic piece with the motor connector at the bottom of the motor. Go ahead and install those bolts and tighten down the motor to the acrylic mount. Now we're going to install the GT2 gear if you had taken it off previously, or we're going to position it if it's still on there. Go ahead and align the grub screw with one of the flat spots, and then we want to align the teeth of the gear with the center groove of that extrusion. The reason why is the belt is going to actually run in the groove of the extrusion, so you want to properly align those teeth on the gear with that extrusion. Then go ahead and tighten down the grub screws. Make sure one of those grub screws is on the flat spot of that motor shaft. Now we're going to install the extruder and hot end assembly. So go ahead and grab those. There's already Delrin wheels installed. That is the nozzle where the filament comes out. Here's the PTFE tube. Make sure it's pushed in all the way. Otherwise you can get some jamming. If you push down on that black collet, you can also pull the PTFE tube out of the hot end. We are going to pull it out and make sure that that is cut perfectly at a 90-degree angle. If it's angled, that will also cause jamming. So go ahead, do that, and then go install it back in. Don't shorten the PTFE tube too much though. After that, it's going to slide on to that extrusion. Once it's on there, make sure it does move freely and there's no play. If there is play, you can tighten up those Delrin wheels just like we did previously. Next, we're going to install the X idler for the belt, and we're also going to install the X end stop. First, get this acrylic piece. You're also going to want to get your bearing set. There's a bearing, a bolt, some washers, nut, all in there. Get a section of your belt. Going to grab one of the end stops. Those have it's a little switch with a black and yellow wire. And we're also going to get some nuts and bolts. We're going to get 4 M4 by 8mm long bolts. You're going to get 4 M4 T-nuts. Then you're also going to get 2 of the M2 10mm long bolts. These are the really small bolts, and then the M2 nuts also. Then you'll also grab this last acrylic piece, which is going to be for our end stop. First, we're going to install 2 of the M4 bolts and T-nuts into the acrylic piece for our X idler. This is the one where it is not rounded at the edge. It does have a flat spot at the edge, so go ahead and install those bolts. And then also we're going to take apart the bearing set where there's the bearings and the washers, and we're basically going to remove everything and then install the bolt through the acrylic piece. So the bolt is coming out of the same end where the T-nuts are, and then we're going to install everything back onto that bolt. And then last, we're going to put the nut back on there and tighten it down. When you tighten it down, you don't want to do it too tight. We still want that bearing to move, but we don't want it to be loose either. Now we're going to install this at the very end of that 2020 extrusion that we just installed the extruder onto. Go ahead and align those T-nuts so that they will go into the groove of the extrusion, and then go ahead and tighten those down to lock those T-nuts into the extrusion also. Now we're going to build the X end stop. You'll notice the acrylic piece, there's some recessed holes. That is actually where the nuts are going to go for our end stop. So the side that does not have the recessed hole is the side that you will insert those M4 bolts through, and then go ahead and install those T-nuts on the other side. The T-nuts will be installed on the side where there is the recess for the end stop nuts. So the end stop is going to be installed just like this. Align those holes, get the M2 bolts, and they will go through, and then those M2 nuts will actually sit in that part of the acrylic that is recessed. Then go ahead and tighten those down. If that doesn't make sense, rewind a little bit and watch the video again so you can see those nuts for the end stop are going to be completely flush. If it does turn, if that nut turns, if you get a flathead screwdriver or something really small, you can actually shove it in there in between the nut and the side wall of the acrylic, and that will hold it in place while you tighten it. Don't tighten it down too much because that can crack your acrylic, but this is a good way to make sure those nuts do not move. Next, align those T-nuts so that we can put them up to the extrusion, and this is going to be installed basically right directly over where the GT2 gear is. Go ahead and tighten those M4 bolts that will turn the T-nuts and lock that piece into the extrusion. Now we're going to go and install the X belt. There is teeth on one side of the belt and it's smooth on the other. We do want to make sure that the smooth side is up, and that's going to just go underneath those Delrin wheels. Then the belt is going to wrap around your GT2 gear on your X motor and the idler bearings on the other side. It's easier if you pull this whole assembly up and off and then flip it upside down. So these belts are going to go around both ends, and then there's going to be a small slot in that X carriage of where your hot end is, and you'll pull the belt through there, and then we'll use zip ties to secure it. I am going to fast forward and get to the end to where you can actually see those locations. You can see here on the X carriage where the belt attaches. Feel free to pause the video if you need to look at it further, but it's going to loop around that X carriage and use zip ties to go ahead and secure the ends of the belts to each other. Then to tension the belt, if you loosen up the M4 bolts here on the X idler side, you can actually push that whole bracket away from the extrusion, and that will tension the belt. Then go ahead and tighten it back down. That's everything for this video. We're going to continue in video 3.